West Coast Muscle Saws. Got some questions to go over this morning. Got several questions about the fuel mixture and different tools, and a few other questions we'll go over. So we'll get started here and take some more of your questions. Maybe we'll see. I get a lot of questions about the fuel, what's the best mix, and how much octane and different things, and how much ethanol you can use. Steel site's got some very good information. So does Husqvarna. If you go to their sites, the ethanol thing, you're not going to get away from it. You can buy clear gas out here on the West Coast. Some of it's mediocre. Some of it's been in the tanks for quite some time before they actually get it to your container. So I've went, I take both sides of the fence on this issue. I've ran ethanol in my saws for years and never had any issues. What you got to be careful of course, is your container. It's got to be airtight. You can't have a leaky to the atmospheric pressure. You cannot have the air getting into it. That draws moisture. And of course, alcohol draws moisture, and if it sets for very long, the alcohol will combine with the water. And you can imagine your fuel tank with the fuel pickup in the bottom, and that saw setting for quite some time, and if it drew moisture, you didn't have a nice tight seal on your chainsaw, also on your fuel container, that ethanol and water combines and drops to the bottom, and of course your fuel pickup is always on the bottom. And so what you're going to get on the startup before you shake it and move the saw around, you're going to get a straight shot of ethanol to that engine, and you can do some major damage to it. And so, of course, we don't say shake it, we say agitate your fuel container, because somebody shook their container and it wasn't sealed and gas went everywhere, and you know the outcome of that. So you want to agitate your fuel container as well as your chainsaw when you're starting them up. It's rare that you'll have or from what I've seen, very rare that you see damage from the ethanol. I mean, ethanol's blamed on everything that goes wrong with chainsaw. Ethanol is the culprit. I don't necessarily agree with that. If done properly, you won't have any issues, but there's guys that'll just say, no, you can't, you're a saw king, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, that's fine. But anyway, I run it in all my saws, even my old vintage saws. I'll run it. I do know that the alcohol does do some damage to the diaphragms. If I were to run this IEL, which it does run good, if I were to run it on my fuel with the ethanol in it, after I was done, I would flush it out good with some clear gas, mixed clear gas. If I wanted to really feel comfortable, I'll let it set in storage. The thing being, of course, don't let it set for very long. As far as your gas from the fuel pumps, you should date your containers, right on your containers when you got the fuel, where you got it. And then make sure that container is sealed properly, and you shouldn't have any problems. Don't get more gas than you need. Don't buy 5 gallons and run and expect it to last, through the year. It just won't happen. I mean, you're going to have issues with it. Octane rating, I get questions a lot on that. The minimum they recommend is 89. The fuel mixture that you can buy pre-mixed, Husqvarna, Steel, and there's some aftermarket ones. I don't know much about the aftermarket ones. I do know about the Steel and the Husqvarna. Very good quality. They use a premium gas, usually 92, 95 octane. Pre-mixed, unopened can, good for 2 years. Open container, of course, I've tried to prove this by letting it set in my shop for quite some time. Open container is good for at least 6 months, and sometimes up to a year after you've cracked the seal. So if you're occasionally using your 2-cycle, chainsaw, weed eater, whatever, 2-cycle, and you're not using it a lot, I would recommend getting some pre-mix, Husqvarna Steel, very good quality. There might be some others out there. I'm sure Steel don't, or Husky don't pump oil right out of the ground in their backyard and make their own. They buy it. What they do, though, is they do specify what they want in that mix. And that's the difference between your aftermarket. They do whatever. Steel and Husqvarna are very particular about their mix, so they pick the ingredients. So that's why I recommend it. It's good quality. No, I can't. If I said you had to use it, of course, then I'd have to buy it. The law states that if I said you bought that new Steel, you've got to use Steel oil, Steel mix. Well, I'd have to supply it to you for free, and of course, we're not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. So you do want to make sure it meets the specifications. And if you want to see the specs, you can go to the Steel site, Husqvarna site, and you can see the specifications for it. That's what I would recommend on that. And let me see, I got some other questions here we'll try to go over. Oh, there's a bit here. I got a question on 2 different saws, but I think it's the same problem. And just let me get up here. Well, Eric, he had a hard time finding a helicoil kit. I'll go over the helicoils real quick. Spark plug hole blowed out, and it's very common, the 2 cycles, if the spark plug is not torqued on a regular basis. Years ago, when the timber cutters bought their saws, they got the bar wrench and their miscellaneous screws and everything when they bought the saw new, and they would actually maintenance every night, tighten every screw, cinch up the spark plug. Well, guys don't do that anymore, and so after time, hot and cold, starting and running that chainsaw, the spark plug can and will come loose. And of course, you can see those hot emissions or hot exhaust coming out around that spark plug. It will damage the threads. I've actually seen guys that actually blowed the spark plug out and hit them. I've had one on a bench that I thought was real tight, which it was, but it was only holding my one little ring, blow right out while I was running it. And so always inspect your threads on where the spark plug goes in. Here's another issue, and some guys will agree, others won't. The helicoil, which is a stainless steel spring, looks like a spring, by and far, for me, over the years, has been the best fix. And here's why. I was at the factory, and they'd actually have some spark plugs that the threads were mediocre. They would actually drill that out, and they would put a helicoil in there. And I noticed it coming through on some of the saws, and I quizzed them about it. They did a bunch of testing, and the helicoil, the wound spring, not the insert, the solid one, actually dissipates the heat better, and so when the saw is heating up, everything kind of heats up the same. Your inserts are a large piece of material, heat up a little slower while that cylinder's heating up, and you got one expanding and one not quite expanding, and then shrinking and not shrinking at the same time. They will work loose over time in a professional application. Probably be fine if you've got a hobby saw, one you don't put a lot of hours on. I would probably say, yeah, that's fine. Also, if the threads are bad and you put the helicoil in and you can tell it's not going to hold, I would then go with the insert because that tap's a little larger. You can actually tap out a little more material and get the insert in there, but it's just a temporary, what I call a Band-Aid fix. It's not going to last a long time if you're a professional cutter. If you're an occasional user, it might last you a lifetime. It's hard to say. It all depends on the characteristics of those threads. So anyway, that's how my feeling on the helicoils, and you can buy the helicoil kits. Helicoil, I understand, is now owned by Stanley Manufacturing, and some guys are having a difficult time finding them. You need to find a good source for them. If you're doing a lot of the repair, if you're a shop and you're doing a lot of repair work, just find you a good source. One of my good sources is Barbero Distributing. That's Barbero Distributing. He's in Springfield, Oregon. He's a distributor, and he specializes in some of the hard-to-find items, mostly geared to professionals. And Rick's his name, great guy. If you're wanting to hook up with someone, you can call him. He might be taking new accounts. He's really busy. He's a pretty big guy out here on the West Coast. But you can call Barbero Distributing, Springfield, Oregon. And he can steer you correctly on those helicoils. Okay, let me look here. On the 2 saws. Let me get back to that. Sorry. Both of them are steels. Both have the running characteristics. One's an 036, one's a 361. They tell me after running the saws, I haven't run them personally, I've never seen the videos of them, run fine and everything, heat up, they turn the switch off, go back to starter, and it won't start. Without doing some testing, you're just shooting in the dark trying to find out what is wrong. A couple tools that I would use if I was doing it. I use this inline tester. Actually, you can run this while the saw is running and cutting. And you see how it works. Plug it into the plug cap and then onto the spark plug. And it will glow. And what you want to do, you can actually do it while it's running. You can actually do this while you're cutting. It's kind of fun to do. Watch that glow, and you will, if you have an ignition starting to break down, it'll just intermittently, you'll see some dark in there and intermittently not work properly, indicating that you've got an ignition issue, not a fuel issue. You've got to separate those two. Sometimes it's hard to do if you don't have the correct tools. If it is an ignition issue, then of course you know to check wiring, check this. This is a very common problem on these here. This cap inside here, there's a spring, hooks up to this main wire. Those will break. Vibration, you can't tell by looking at it. You've got to pull and look inside here at the same time. You'll pull and see if this separates. If it separates, of course, then you've got a connection issue with the connector for the wire. Easy fix. If that's not it, then you've got to dig deeper. You've got to check your wiring switches, grounding on the coil, different things to check. But now if if it lights up good and when you go to restart it still lights up, then you more than likely have a fuel delivery issue. And it's hard to tell the difference when you shut it off and it quits, and then you go to fire up and it don't start. A lot of guys, I get a lot of calls on the fuel issue, and I'll tell them, well, it's the inlet needle weeping. And they'll say, well, Rich, I don't know about that. It just won't fire. Well, guys don't realize it doesn't take much fuel. I mean, we're talking like half a teaspoon or less in the crankcase, not on the top, on the crankcase, fumes. It will not hot restart. It just won't. You've got to take the spark plug out, and then again, this is one of those, don't try this at home in your backyard, don't burn down the neighborhood. Switch off, compressed air outside, blow some compressed air gently in there in the plug hole, stand back, spin it over, don't get gas all over you and light yourself up. And then try a restart, and more than likely it will fire right back up, telling you that that inlet needle, and that's usually what it is not sealing. And we've talked about the inlet needles before. They will not, the carburetor on the inside that little area where the seat sets gets a ring on it or debris, and it won't seal properly. You can put a new inlet needle in there, and it'll work for a little while, then it starts weeping. We call it weeping. It'll start weeping again, and it'll drip when you turn this off. Of course, the fuel tank's pressurized, and that's called geysering in the summertime when you want to fill up your saw. It's halfway full, it's a hot day, and you're out fighting a fire, and you don't slowly loosen that cap. You open it up fast, that gas is boiling in that tank. It's so hot, it'll blow all over you. Well, it's pressurized, and of course you can see pressurized against the inlet needle. And in that weeping, you don't know it, but it's pumping that little bit of minute amount of fuel in there in the venturi right into the crankcase. So it won't start. I won't say 100% of the time. That's usually two of the most common issues when I get a call that the saw will not start. It's one or the other. And I usually lean more towards the carburetor because the ignitions in the last 10, 15 years are pretty much bulletproof. There are some glitches. The tech guys out there that work in the shops, they know certain models that just act up and they just won't work properly. So anyway, check that, and then the tool for that, there's two different versions of a pressure gauge. I mean, there's several versions, but this is a small one strictly for pumping up the carburetor on the inlet nipple. Let me see here. And of course, what you want to do is hold pressure, but you may need to check your tool and everything before you do this. I had guys have a leak somewhere in their tooling or in the gauge, so you always want to test it before you test the carburetor to verify your tool is working properly. Then you don't pump up a bunch. Years ago, it was the idea was pump that carburetor up till it pops off the inlet needle. Well, years later, they discovered that damages the inlet needle area, causing problems. So now you just pump it up just a couple pumps, and it should hold. That's how you test that. And if it bleeds, of course, we're all bleeding off. And then, of course, you've narrowed it down to probably the inlet needle, not 100% of the time again, but probably the inlet needle. Hope that helps you two guys on that hot start. And then I've got a gentleman from Quebec, my friend up there. He's got a 562, and I understand that it's the earlier version saw, and they had a lot of issues with the earlier versions. Hot starts. Husqvarna fought this issue for quite some time. I helped him out a little bit on it. it just had some glitches. A lot of the time, the only fix is to upgrade both the control box, that's the coil, and the carburetor and the control box or the inlet needle electronics on the carburetor. You replace both of them. It's got to be a match set. You've got to match this up with a serial number. You really need to get a guy in your back pocket. Should be a good Husqvarna tech to get you through that, to get you the correct matchup. And then the carburetor has to be calibrated before you put it on there. The software has to be downloaded to it to get to work properly. So more than that's like I said, it's a hard one to diagnose. From a friend up there in Quebec, it's hard to diagnose without having a saw there to actually see it and diagnose it. Sounds like it's that. One thing you can do, and they did this on the earlier saws, is to, and we talked about this last time, you take that saw, you get it running, and the change of elevation is real critical on these auto tunes and the M-tronics. The saw has to adjust to all the elements that's all around it. And so the way you do that quickly is when you're out in a higher elevation, find you a down tree, log, small one, start the saw up, let it warm up a little bit, stick the nose into the wood, horizontally drag that saw with the nose in it, down about 4 inches of bar nose into the log for 60 seconds. And at a constant RPM of half to 3/4 throttle. And you can actually hear that engine adjust. If you're paying attention, you will actually hear it settle down and calibrate for the environment that you're in. The newer versions, M-tronics and the auto-tune, haven't had that many problems. They're pretty much over that initial issues they had with it, so I'm not too concerned over that. Another hot start issue is, of course, the fuel, summer fuel, winter fuel. They are different temperatures of the burn, they call it. And make sure you're running the correct fuel for the time of the year. And then again, we talked about the geysering. Geysering, that fuel actually will turn to a vapor in the carburetor. On that purge bulb, it's not a primer. All those purge bulbs, they're called purge bulbs on the chainsaws. And what they do is when that fuel and saw is hot, it's turned to vapor in that carburetor. You should pump that purge. It's not going to flood that saw. It's going to circulate that fuel from the tank, through the lines, through the carburetor, back into the tank, pump it 6-8 times. It's going to turn it back into liquid instead of get rid of the vapor. And it will start easier. And that's true on your top handles. Some of the Echoes run really lean, pretty warm. That little 211, that little hot rod runs a little warm, and so on a restart, you really should pump that purge. Not a primer. I mean, it's not a primer. It's a purge. Circulate that and get that fresh fuel in there. And, of course, you can use it on the cold saws. It does help a little bit. A couple more questions here. Let's take a peek here. Yeah, Robert, I was talking about your old 36 there. When you shut it off, it won't restart. I want you to try that and let me know. You can email me and see if that helps. And Pierre, I was talking about your 562 up there in Quebec. Let me know if that don't help a little bit, and give me a little more history on the year of the saw and how many hours on and stuff like that. And just a minute here. Parts for the old Tilson carburetors. You know, the HL series, you can also buy different HL. There's HL series models, and you can actually buy the HL series kit. There's two different ones I use a lot of. You can call Myrtle Creek Saw Shop. They'll tell you what the two ones they keep in stock. Works on a bunch of those old HL series carburetors. Saw Shop number 541-863-5387. Becca is a good contact person. She's very good on the parts for these. They used to make, we talked about that little damage on the inlet needle seat. They actually made a coining tool to reshape that down there for years. If you got one, boy, good for you. I've still got one. I occasionally use it. And if you're familiar with hydraulics, they do a lot of coining, which is on a seat of some high pressure hydraulics. They actually put the coining tool in there and give it a slight whack with the hammer and give it an indentation. Gives it almost 100% seal. And that's what this coining tool did for the carburetors on that. I had several of them. For whatever reason, they quit making them. Probably guys not knowing how to use them properly, smacking that thing with a 5-pounder and driving it through the other side. Who knows? Anyway, they quit making them. I still got one I occasionally use. The best fix I've seen lately is a soda blaster. You can pick them up at Harbor Freight, real cheap. Get you some good soda mix or soda powder to put in there. Not baking soda. They actually make the at the Harbor Freight. You can pick up a container of the baking soda. It's not really baking. It's soda, but it's not for baking. Use that and take the whole carburetor apart, blast it, and it'll really clean out that area and give you a good shot, especially if it's a vintage saw you're just wanting to get running. Time for a couple more, then I gotta get out of here. See what we got here, hang on. Okay, we got the heel coil question there for the gentleman there. Hang on. Break-in periods. Okay, they've been all over the board on this from the manufacturers on how you should break in your saw. Then you got your guys with the hot rod saws that are just these monster saws are just running wide open, screaming. Manufacturers now are suggesting for the first 10 hours, don't freewheel that engine, meaning run it, but don't run it out of the wood just so you can hear it run. Don't just hold it up there and just hit the 10,000 limiter or whatever. Don't just sit there and do that. So if you're limbing, keep that finger down on that trigger. You can run about half throttle and zip, 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 do your limbing. It's okay to run it for the first 10 hours if you're actually bucking some big wood or falling some big trees. It's okay to wide open throttle because you do need to power through that when the tree goes over. But don't just freewheel with that. Let me look up here. I got a couple things here the guys are asking here. Okay. Hey Brent, how you doing? Frank, see you. Bill. How old am I? I don't know if you want to know or not. Old enough to retire, I'll say that. Steel does use primer bulbs on a lot of their newer saws, Brent. I've seen it on a lot of them. Pretty common. Let's see here. Yeah. Thanks, Frank. Appreciate that. Okay. Okay, Bill, you got your 270 that floods. That's, we went over that a little bit. It's very possible that you got the issue with that. Yeah, I remember doing your 394 Arborist 460. I do remember doing that saw. Buck and Billy Ray, I watch your videos all the time, brother. How you doing? You are the man. I tell you what, he's a Mac guy, and I tell you what, he's a legend out there. Just a great guy. I love his videos. Take care. Well, guys, I'm going to wind her down. I'm going to try to shoot again for Saturdays. I like the Saturday 10 o'clock. That's Pacific time. And we will go over some more. I got some more questions coming in. We'll go over that and try to get into give me some ideas what we want to talk about on the saws. Like I've told you before, I go back many years. I can even worked on some of these old. Actually, believe it or not, some of these saws when I started, they were still around. I love that big Homelite 2000 right there. That Super Pro 81, Billy Ray Super Pro 81, unbelievable saw. Love it. Worked on hundreds of those. Back then, guys would use them on the landing. They cut timber with them too, run a 36. They'd use them on the landing. And what I mean by the landing is where they drug the logs in, and they didn't have the mechanical means to take all the limbs off like they do today, those harvesters that just process that. And so they would have, some landings would have 8 of those on the job site, because then they had about 5 guys. All their job was all day long was bumping limbs off and bucking the log up to be able to load onto the log trucks. And so that's what they did, and they'd bring them in every night. We'd have Ron Marriott, another legend out here. He would, him and I would work till all hours of the night getting those landing saws running up to so they could go another day of work. They took a beating. That was one of the best saws ever made. Love it. Well, guys, appreciate your time watching, and we'll try to hook up again next weekend and